Moss Side, a neighbourhood in Manchester, England, was once a flourishing district during the height of the Industrial Revolution. As factories and textile mills boomed, working-class families, initially white British and later Irish immigrants, flocked to the area for employment and opportunity. It was an early hub of industry, attracting those seeking a better life. After World War II, the British government encouraged immigration from the Commonwealth to rebuild the country. This led to a surge of Caribbean, South Asian, and African residents who made Moss Side their home. Many arrived under the British Nationality Act 1948, which granted full citizenship rights to Commonwealth citizens, yet they faced significant discrimination upon arrival. While initially welcomed as a solution to labour shortages, these communities were quickly marginalised in housing, employment and public life. Over time, Moss Side's infrastructure became strained, overcrowding worsened, and basic services deteriorated. The influx of people into a space not properly expanded or maintained laid the groundwork for what would become systemic neglect. Key social indicators like infant mortality and school dropout rates began to diverge sharply from national averages, reflecting the growing socio-economic divide. Urban policies failed to account for the changing demographic. Instead of integrating Moss Side into the city's growth plans, planners began to ignore it. What started as economic neglect quickly morphed into targeted marginalization. Employment hubs moved away, and with them went opportunity. Meanwhile, Moss Side was left behind, both economically and socially. By the 1960s, housing quality had declined significantly. Subdivided Victorian homes became overcrowded rental units. Local authorities often cited Moss Side's high turnover rates and transient populations as barriers to investment, reinforcing a cycle of disinvestment. Census data from the 1970s revealed that BAME populations in Moss Side were more likely to be unemployed, underhoused, and in poorer health than their white counterparts. At the same time, national narratives portrayed Moss Side as a problem area, amplifying stigma. Media coverage often focused disproportionately on crime and unrest, omitting the structural causes behind the decline. Reports and political rhetoric began associating Moss Side with lawlessness, feeding into policy decisions that prioritized containment over development. Despite the growing population, civic amenities lagged. Public transport links were poor, limiting access to employment and education elsewhere in the city. The area received little attention during urban regeneration initiatives in the 1970s and 80s, further exacerbating its isolation. What had once been a thriving multi-ethnic community became the subject of intense public scrutiny. Many government reports acknowledged the deprivation, but failed to allocate sustained funding or long-term strategic plans. Short-term fixes replaced structural reform. Community cohesion suffered as a result of underinvestment in integration programs. Language barriers and cultural misunderstandings were common, yet there was little effort to promote intercultural dialogue or support new residents. The Windrush generation, in particular, faced broken promises of belonging and opportunity, deepening distrust in public institutions. The cultural makeup of Moss Side changed rapidly, but the city's services and planning failed to keep pace. Schools were unprepared for the diversity of students. Hospitals and clinics were overwhelmed. Housing stock deteriorated. Crime rates rose not due to inherent flaws in the people, but because of crumbling infrastructure and lack of opportunity. The housing crisis in Moss Side was not just a byproduct of bad management, it was the result of deliberate exclusion. Though redlining is more often associated with the United States, the UK had its own forms of racialized urban planning. BAME, Black, Asian, and minority ethnic communities were disproportionately denied mortgages or placed in substandard council housing. A 1973 report from the Manchester and Salford Council for Community Relations highlighted that ethnic minorities were often steered toward the lowest quality accommodations, and faced open discrimination from landlords and estate agents. Dispersal policies further segregated communities, limiting their access to better resourced neighborhoods. In 1961, it was estimated that over 75% of black residents in Manchester lived in privately rented accommodation, much of it overcrowded and poorly maintained. A 1983 survey revealed that only 5% of black families in Moss Side owned their homes, compared to over 40% of white families citywide, a stark disparity that points to systemic barriers in access to property. Slum clearance programs, touted as urban renewal, promised better housing but delivered devastation. Entire streets were demolished, families displaced, and in many cases, rehousing never materialized. Those who were rehoused often found themselves in worse conditions, further from community support systems. The rate of rehousing fell far below displacement levels, leading to temporary accommodations that became semi-permanent. The very layout of Moss Side was altered to contain and control. Road planning limited access to main thoroughfares, isolating it economically and physically. Gentrification was never on the table. Containment was the priority. Dead-end streets and isolating infrastructure inhibited both community growth and external investment. In some cases, buildings left after clearances stood derelict for years. Promised parks, recreation centers, and libraries never came. Moss Side became a repository for the city's unwanted, and the physical space began to reflect this social status. Crime prevention architecture, like tall fences and CCTV cameras, replaced thoughtful community development. Government-led housing policies in the 1980s reinforced segregation by creating high-density housing blocks with minimal oversight and maintenance. These developments, while solving short-term shelter needs, quickly became synonymous with deprivation due to lack of services and rapid deterioration. According to a 1987 housing audit, more than 60% of council housing in Moss Side was categorized as below acceptable living standard. The right to buy policy, introduced in 1980, while offering home ownership opportunities, further marginalized Moss Side residents. Because of persistent economic inequality, many could not afford to purchase their homes, leading to increased privatization and speculative ownership by absentee landlords, which contributed to slum conditions. Nationally, nearly 1.5 million council homes were sold off under this policy by the early 2000s, with disproportionately fewer sales in disadvantaged areas like Moss Side. The systemic denial of home ownership opportunities for ethnic minorities prevented generational wealth from taking root. Families that could have built stable lives instead faced chronic instability. The relationship between Moss Side residents and the police was historically adversarial. In the 1970s and 80s, stop and search practices were aggressively applied to young black men, often without cause. Under the controversial Sue's laws, derived from the Vagrancy Act 1824, individuals could be stopped and searched on the suspicion they might commit a crime. In practice, these powers were disproportionately used against black youths, creating an atmosphere of constant surveillance and intimidation. This over-policing culminated in the July 1981 Moss Side riots, sparked by the aggressive policing and the beating of a 20-year-old black man during a stop. The unrest escalated into days of rioting. Over 300 officers were injured, dozens of residents were arrested, and property damage spanned dozens of buildings. While media narratives often focused on criminality, local voices highlighted a desperate outcry against decades of injustice. The Scarman Report, released in response to similar uprisings in Brixton, acknowledged racial disadvantage, but fell short of recommending sweeping reforms. Moss Side received increased funding for youth centers and community initiatives, but these efforts were undercut by ongoing police aggression. The Macpherson Report, in 1999, following the murder of Stephen Lawrence, officially identified institutional racism within the police. a validation long overdue for communities like Moss Side. Residents often described feeling under siege. Raids, mass arrests, and aggressive crowd control during community events fueled resentment. Children grew up viewing police as threats, not protectors. Even when crime was reported, victims were reluctant to cooperate, fearing retaliation or indifference. The heavy policing also affected public spaces. Events like the Moss Side Carnival, which once celebrated Caribbean culture and community pride, faced scrutiny and over-monitoring, dampening morale and discouraging participation. Youths faced frequent harassment on their way to school or work, fostering generational mistrust that proved difficult to unlearn. Community police relations programs launched in the 1990s and early 2000s saw mixed results. While a few community liaison officers built trust locally, systemic practices remained unchanged. Surveillance technologies expanded, and police presence intensified, especially after the 2001 riots in Oldham and Bradford heightened fears of urban unrest. Policing in Moss Side went beyond law enforcement. It symbolized the government's approach to the community as a problem to be managed, not a partner to be engaged. This dynamic cemented a legacy of fear and resentment that continues to echo today, hindering trust and community safety initiatives. When Manchester's manufacturing industry declined, Moss Side was left particularly vulnerable. The jobs that once sustained families vanished, and no alternative economic structure was provided. Instead of targeted investment, the area received stigmatization. Unemployment in Moss Side soared, especially among the youth. Discrimination in hiring practices made it nearly impossible for qualified Black and Asian candidates to find work. Employers either didn't hire from Moss Side or used an applicant's address as a reason to reject them. Public and private investment dried up. Supermarkets, banks, and service providers exited the area, leaving behind economic deserts. The message was clear. Moss Side was no longer a part of Manchester's future. Programs meant to help communities left behind often failed to materialize or were short-term PR projects. Even when funding arrived, it was managed by outside organizations with little understanding of local needs. Without stable employment, crime became one of the few viable paths for income, not because people wanted to commit crimes, but because the system provided no alternative. Drug use and gang activity became both a symptom and a scapegoat. Government job creation programs were either absent or poorly implemented. Training schemes were outdated and misaligned with real market demand. Meanwhile, employment centers frequently lacked culturally competent staff, failing to effectively engage the local population. The closure of local transport links further limited job access. Residents often had to travel long distances to find work, which was not feasible for many without cars or with caregiving responsibilities. The compounded burden made economic mobility nearly impossible. Small business development also suffered, with limited access to credit and high insurance premiums due to perceived risk. Would-be entrepreneurs were often shut out of the economy. Community-based economies that could have flourished were instead stifled. The lack of economic opportunity affected every facet of life: housing security, educational outcomes, health, and family cohesion. Poverty deepened not because of apathy, but because opportunity was structurally removed and continually denied. The local education system in Moss Side was chronically underfunded. Schools were overcrowded, staff turnover was high, and expectations for students were low. Black and minority ethnic students were disproportionately placed in lower ability tracks, regardless of aptitude. Some schools in Moss Side operated with outdated curricula and minimal extracurricular opportunities. When schools lack funding, it's not just books and computers that are missing. It's mentorship, counseling, and enrichment programs that help students thrive. The result was a widening achievement gap that mirrored the inequalities found in other public sectors. Access to early childhood education and specialized support for students with learning difficulties was also severely limited. Programs that existed in other parts of Manchester were often missing in Moss Side. This meant many children entered secondary school already behind their peers and with fewer tools for success. Healthcare access was equally problematic. With few local clinics and long wait times, many residents avoided seeking care altogether. Mental health services were virtually non-existent, despite high levels of stress and trauma. Rates of chronic illness and untreated conditions rose, further lowering the community's quality of life. Public health initiatives often failed to reach Moss Side or were designed without input from community leaders. This disconnect led to poorly attended outreach programs and missed opportunities for preventive care. Young mothers, for instance, struggled to access prenatal care, while elders with mobility issues were often isolated without regular checkups. Social services, when present, were often perceived as punitive rather than supportive. Trust in public institutions eroded, reinforcing a sense of abandonment. For many families, social workers were viewed not as helpers, but as potential threats to their stability. Reports of discriminatory treatment and lack of cultural understanding only deepened this mistrust, discouraging many from seeking help, even when desperately needed. Despite these systemic barriers, Moss Side has always had a core of resilience. Local leaders, activists, and organizations emerged to fight back. The African Caribbean community, in particular, organized around issues of housing, policing, and education. Groups like the Moss Side Community Action Group and local chapters of national civil rights organizations played pivotal roles. They offered legal support, community events, and educational programming designed to empower residents. In the 1980s and 90s, the rise of community development corporations allowed local actors to advocate for economic inclusion and urban regeneration. Moss Side also became a cradle for cultural resistance. From reggae and hip-hop to calypso and spoken word, the neighborhood's youth used music and art as a means to assert identity and push back against negative stereotypes. Manchester's famed carnival, rooted in Caribbean traditions, blossomed into one of the UK's most vibrant cultural celebrations, often doubling as a political platform. Women played a crucial role, organizing mutual aid networks, youth mentorship schemes, and community health projects. Figures like Louise de Kokodia championed social justice from within and outside formal institutions, bridging the gap between community activism and policy influence. Faith-based organizations, including mosques and churches, served not only as spiritual centers, but also as anchors for food banks, housing support, and after-school tutoring. Their consistent presence helped stabilize families during economic and social turmoil. Local heroes emerged not from politics, but from the streets. Mentors, educators, shopkeepers, and parents who held the fabric of Moss Side together through hard times. Community centers became lifelines. Faith-based groups offered shelter and food when the state did not. Today, new initiatives seek to revitalize Moss Side. Community gardens, local cooperatives, and youth programs are part of a slow but hopeful renaissance. A growing number of youth-led organizations now focus on entrepreneurship, mental health awareness, and digital literacy. The spirit of resistance remains alive, evolving with each new generation. Moss Side's story is not one of failure by its people, but failure towards its people. It is a microcosm of how systemic racism in housing, policing, economics, and education can combine to marginalize entire communities. Yet the resilience of Moss Side offers a blueprint for resistance. Real progress demands that we confront these truths and commit to structural change. Fixing what was broken requires more than apologies. It requires resources, representation, and accountability, because what was built to fail can still be rebuilt, stronger, fairer, and by design. The people of Moss Side have never lacked talent, culture, or strength. What they have lacked is justice. Let this documentary serve as both a chronicle and a call to action. Justice isn't given, it is built, and Moss Side is ready to build.